The Gift of Therapy, Chapter 6. Empathy, Looking Out the Patient's Window. It's strange how certain phrases or events lodge in one's mind and offer ongoing guidance or comfort. Decades ago, I saw a patient with breast cancer who had throughout adolescence been locked in a long, bitter struggle with her naysaying father. Yearning for some form of reconciliation, for a new, fresh beginning to their relationship, she looked forward to her father's driving her to college, a time when she would be alone with him for several hours. But the long anticipated trip proved a disaster. Her father behaved true to form by grousing at length about the ugly, garbage littered creek by the side of the road. She, on the other hand, saw no litter whatsoever in the beautiful, rustic, unspoiled stream. She could find no way to respond, and eventually, lapsing into silence, they spent the remainder of the trip looking away from each other. Later, she made the same trip alone and was astounded to note that there were two streams, one on each side of the road. This time I was the driver, she said sadly, and the stream I saw through my window on the driver's side was just as ugly and polluted as my father had described it. But by the time she had learned to look out her father's window, it was too late. Her father was dead and buried. That story has remained with me, and on many occasions I have reminded myself and my students, look out the other's window. Try to see the world as your patient sees it. The woman who told me the story died a short time later of breast cancer, and I regret that I cannot tell her how useful her story has been over the years, to me, my students, and many patients. 50 years ago, Carl Rogers identified accurate empathy as one of the three essential characteristics of the effective therapist, along with unconditional positive regard and genuineness, and launched the field of psychotherapy research, which ultimately marshaled considerable evidence to support the effectiveness of empathy. Therapy is enhanced if the therapist enters accurately into the patient's world. Patients profit enormously simply from the experience of being fully seen and fully understood. Hence, it is important for us to appreciate how our patient experiences the past, present, and future. I make a point of repeatedly checking out my assumptions. For example, Bob, when I think about your relationship to Mary, this is what I understand. You say you are convinced that you and she are incompatible, that you want very much to separate from her, that you feel bored in her company and avoid spending entire evenings with her. Yet now, when she has made the move you wanted and has pulled away, you once again yearn for her. I think I hear you saying that you don't want to be with her, yet you cannot bear the idea of her not being available when you might need her. Am I right so far? Accurate empathy is most important in the domain of the immediate present, that is, the here and now of the therapy hour. Keep in mind that patients view the therapy hours very differently from therapists. Again and again, therapists, even highly experienced ones, are greatly surprised to rediscover this phenomenon. Not uncommonly, one of my patients begins an hour by describing an intense emotional reaction to something that occurred during the previous hour, and I feel baffled and cannot for the life of me imagine what it was that happened in that hour to elicit such a powerful response. Such divergent views between patient and therapist first came to my attention years ago when I was conducting research on the experience of group members in both therapy groups and encounter groups. I asked a great many group members to fill out a questionnaire in which they identified critical incidents for each meeting. The rich and varied incidents described differed greatly from their group leaders' assessments of each meeting's critical incidents, and a similar difference existed between members' and leaders' selection of the most critical incidents for the entire group experience. My next encounter with differences in patient and therapist perspectives occurred in an informal experiment in which a patient and I each wrote summaries of each therapy hour. The experiment has a curious history. The patient, Ginny, was a gifted creative writer who suffered not only a severe writing block, but a block in all forms of expressiveness. A year's attendance in my therapy group was relatively unproductive. She revealed little of herself, gave little of herself to the other members, and idealized me so greatly that any genuine encounter was not possible. Then, when Ginny had to leave the group because of financial pressures, I proposed an unusual experiment. I offered to see her in individual therapy with the proviso that, in lieu of payment, She'd write a free flowing, uncensored summary of each therapy hour, expressing all the feelings and thoughts she had not verbalized during our session. I, for my part, proposed to do exactly the same and suggested we each hand in our sealed weekly reports to my secretary and that every few months we would read each other's notes. My proposal was overdetermined. I hoped that the writing assignment might not only liberate my patient's writing, but encourage her to express herself more freely in therapy. Perhaps I hoped her reading my notes might improve our relationship. I intended to write uncensored notes revealing my own experiences during the hour, my pleasures, frustrations, distractions. It was possible that, if Ginny could see me more realistically, she could begin to de idealize me and relate to me on a more human basis. As an aside, not germane to this discussion of empathy, I would add that this experience occurred at a time when I was attempting to develop my voice as a writer, and my offer to write in parallel with my patient had also a self serving motive. It afforded me an unusual writing exercise and an opportunity to break my professional shackles, to liberate my voice by writing all that came to mind immediately following each hour. The exchange of notes every few months provided a Rashomon like experience. Though we had shared the hour, we experienced and remembered it idiosyncratically. For one thing, we valued very different parts of the session. My elegant and brilliant interpretations, she never even heard them. Instead, she valued the small personal acts I barely noticed, my complimenting her clothing, or appearance, or writing, my awkward apologies for arriving a couple minutes late, my chuckling at her satire, my teasing her when we role played. Footnote. Later, I used the session summaries in psychotherapy teaching and was struck by their pedagogical value. Students reported that our joint notes took on the characteristics of an epistolary novel, and eventually in 1974, the patient, Ginny Elkin, a pseudonym, and I published them under the title Every Day Gets a Little Closer. 20 years later, the book was released in paperback and began a new life. In retrospect, the subtitle, A Twice Told Therapy, would have been more apt, but Ginny loved the old Buddy Holly song and wanted to get married to its tune. All these experiences have taught me not to assume that the patient and I have the same experience during the hour. When patients discuss feelings they had the previous session, I make a point of inquiring about their experience and almost always learn something new and unexpected. Being empathic is so much a part of everyday discourse. Popular singers warble platitudes about being in the other's skin, walking in the other's moccasins, that we tend to forget the complexity of the process. It is extraordinarily difficult to know really what the other feels. Far too often we project our own feelings onto the other. When teaching students about empathy, Erich Fromm often cited Terence's statement from 2,000 years ago, I am human, and let nothing human be alien to me, and urged us to be open to that part of ourselves that corresponds to any deed or fantasy offered by patients, no matter how heinous, violent, lustful, masochistic, or sadistic. If we didn't, he suggested we investigate why we have chosen to close that part of ourselves. Of course, a knowledge of the patient's past vastly enhances your ability to look out the patient's window. If, for example, patients have suffered a long series of losses, then they will view the world through the spectacles of loss. They may be disinclined, for example, to let you matter or to get too close because of fear of suffering yet another loss. Hence, the investigation of the past may be important, not for the sake of constructing causal chains, but because it permits us to be more accurately empathic. Chapter 7. Teach empathy. Accurate empathy is an essential trait not only for therapists, but for patients, and we must help patients develop empathy for others. Keep in mind that our patients generally come to see us because of their lack of success in developing and maintaining gratifying interpersonal relationships. Many fail to empathize with the feelings and experiences of others. I believe that the here and now offers therapists a powerful way to help patients develop empathy. The strategy is straightforward. Help patients experience empathy with you, and they will automatically make the necessary extrapolations to other important figures in their lives. It is quite common for therapists to ask patients, how a certain statement or action of theirs might affect others. I suggest simply that the therapist include himself in that question. When patients venture a guess about how I feel, I generally hone in on it. If, for example, a patient interprets some gesture or comment and says, "You must be very tired of seeing me," or "I know you're sorry you ever got involved with me," or "I've got to be your most unpleasant hour of the day," I will do some reality testing and comment, "Is there a question in there for me?" This is, of course, simple social skills training. I urge the patient to address or question me directly, and I endeavor to answer in a manner that is direct and helpful. For example, I might respond, "You're reading me entirely wrong. I don't have any of those feelings. I've been pleased with our work. You've shown a lot of courage. You work hard. You've never missed a session. You've never been late. You've taken chances by sharing so many intimate things with me. In every way here, you do your job. But I do notice that whenever you venture a guess about how I feel about you, it often does not jibe with my inner experience. And the error is always in the same direction. You read me as caring for you much less than I do." Another example: "I know you've heard this story before, but," and the patient proceeded to tell me a long story. "I'm struck by how often you say that I've heard the story before and then proceed to tell it. It's a bad habit, I know. I don't understand it. What's your hunch about how I feel listening to the same story over again?" "Must be tedious. You probably want the hour to end. You're probably checking the clock." "Is there a question in there for me?" "Well, do you?" I am impatient hearing the same story again. I feel it gets interposed between the two of us as though you're not really talking to me. "You were right about my checking the clock. I did, but it was with the hope that when your story ended, we would still have time to make contact before the end of the session." Chapter 8: Let the Patient Matter to You. It was more than 30 years ago that I heard the saddest of psychotherapy tales. I was spending a year's fellowship in London at the redoubtable Tavistock Clinic and met with a prominent British psychoanalyst and a group therapist who was retiring at the age of 70, and the evening before had held the final meeting of a long-term therapy group. The members, many of whom had been in the group for more than a decade, had reflected upon the many changes they had seen in one another, and all had agreed that there was one person who had not changed whatsoever: the therapist. In fact, they said he was exactly the same after 10 years. He then looked up at me and, tapping on his desk for emphasis, said in his most teacherly voice, "That, my boy, is good technique." I've always been saddened as I recall this incident. It is sad to think of being together with others for so long, and yet never to have let them matter enough to be influenced and changed by them. I urge you to let your patients matter to you, to let them enter your mind, influence you, change you, and not to conceal this from them. Years ago, I listened to a patient vilifying several of her friends for quote unquote sleeping around. This was typical of her. She was highly critical of everyone she described to me. I wondered aloud about the impact of her judgmentalism on her friends. "What do you mean?" she responded. "Does my judging others have an impact on you?" "I think it makes me wary of revealing too much of myself. If we were involved as friends, I'd be cautious about showing you my darker side." "Well, this issue seems pretty black and white to me. What's your opinion about such casual sex? Can you personally possibly imagine separating sex from love?" "Of course I can. That's part of our human nature." "That repulses me." The hour ended on that note, and for days afterward I felt unsettled by our interaction, and I began the following session by telling her that it had been uncomfortable for me to think that she was repulsed by me. She was startled by my reaction and told me I had entirely misunderstood her. What she had meant was that she was repulsed at human nature and at her own sexual wishes, not repulsed by me or my words. Later in the session, she returned to the incident and said that though she regretted being the cause of discomfort for me, she was nonetheless moved and pleased at having mattered to me. The interchange dramatically catalyzed therapy. In subsequent sessions, she trusted me more and took much greater risks. Recently, one of my patients sent me an email. "I love you, but I also hate you because you leave, not just to Argentina and New York, but for all I know, to Tibet and Timbuktu. But because every week you leave, you close the door. You probably just go turn on the baseball game or check the Dow and make a cup of tea whistling a happy tune and don't think of me at all. And why should you? This statement gives voice to the great unasked question for many patients. Do you ever think about me between sessions, or do I just drop out of your life for the rest of the week? My experience is that often patients do not vanish from my mind for the week. And if I've had thoughts since the last session that might be helpful for them to hear, I make sure to share them. I feel if I've made an error in the session, I believe it is always best to acknowledge it directly. Once a patient described a dream. I'm in my old elementary school and I speak to a little girl who is crying and has run out of her classroom. I say, "You must remember that there are many who love you, and it would be best not to run away from everyone." I suggested that she was both the speaker and the little girl, and that the dream paralleled and echoed the very thing we had been discussing in our last session. She responded, "Of course." That nettled me. She characteristically failed to acknowledge my helpful comments, and therefore I insisted on analyzing her comment, "Of course." Later, as I thought about this unsatisfying session, I realized the problem between us had been due largely to my stubborn determination to crack the "of course" in order to obtain full credit for my insight into the dream. I opened the following session by acknowledging my immature behavior, and then we proceeded to have one of our most productive sessions, in which she revealed several important secrets she had long withheld. Therapist disclosure begets patient disclosure. Patients sometimes matter enough to enter into my dreams, and if I believe that it will in some way facilitate therapy, I do not hesitate to share the dream. I once dreamed that I met a patient in an airport and attempted to give her a hug, but was obstructed by the large purse she was holding. I related the dream to her and connected it to our discussion in our previous session about the quote unquote baggage she brought into her relationship with me. That is, her strong and ambivalent feelings toward her father. She was moved by my sharing the dream and acknowledged the logic of my connecting it to her conflation of her father and me, but suggested another cogent meaning to the dream, namely, that the dream expresses my regrets that our professional contract, symbolized by the purse, a container for money, to wit, the therapy fees, precluded a fully consummated relationship. I couldn't deny that her interpretation made compelling sense, and that it reflected feelings lurking somewhere deep within me. Chapter 9. Acknowledge Your Errors. It was the analyst D.W. Winnicott who once made the trenchant observation that the difference between good mothers and bad mothers is not the commission of errors, but what they do with them. I saw one patient who had left her previous therapist for what might appear a trivial session. In her third meeting, she had wept copiously and reached for the Kleenex, only to find an empty box. The therapist had then begun searching his office in vain for a tissue or a handkerchief, and finally scurried down the hall to the washroom to return with a handful of toilet tissue. In the following session, she commented that the incident must have been embarrassing for him, whereupon he denied any embarrassment whatsoever. The more she pressed, the more he dug in and turned the questions back to why she persisted in doubting his answer. Eventually, she concluded, rightly it seemed to me, that he had not dealt with her in an authentic manner, and decided that she could not trust him for the long work ahead. An example of acknowledged error. A patient who had suffered many earlier losses and was dealing with the impending loss of her husband, who was dying of a brain tumor, once asked me whether I ever thought about her between sessions. I responded, "I often think about your situation." Wrong answer. My words outraged her. "How could you say this?" she asked. "You who were supposed to help, you who asked me to share my innermost personal feelings." Those words reinforced my fears that I have no self, that everyone thinks about my situation and no one thinks about me. Later, she added that not only does she have no self, but that I also avoided bringing my own self into my meetings with her. I brooded about her words during the following week, and concluding that she was absolutely correct, began the next session by owning up to my error and by asking her to help me identify and understand my own blind spots in this matter. Many years ago, I read an article by Sandor Ferenczi, a gifted analyst, in which he reported saying to a patient, "Perhaps you can help me locate some of my own blind spots." This is another one of those phrases that have taken up lodging in my mind and that I often make use of in my clinical work. Together, we looked at my alarm at the depth of her anguish and my deep desire to find some way, any way short of physical holding, to comfort her. Perhaps I suggested I had been backing away from her in recent sessions because of concern that I had been too seductive by promising much more relief than I would ever be able to deliver. I believed that this was the context for my interpersonal statement about her quote unquote situation. It would have been so much better, I told her, to have simply been honest about my aching to console her and my confusion about how to proceed. If you make a mistake, admit it. Any attempt at cover up will ultimately backfire. At some level, the patient will sense you are acting in bad faith, and therapy will suffer. Furthermore, an open admission of error is good model setting for patients and another sign that they matter to you. Chapter 10. Create a new therapy for each patient. There is a great paradox inherent in much contemporary psychotherapy research. Because researchers have a legitimate need to compare one form of psychotherapy treatment with some other treatment, pharmacological or another form of psychotherapy, they must offer a quote unquote standardized therapy, that is, a uniform therapy for all the subjects in the project that can in the future be replicated by other researchers and therapists. In other words, the same standards hold as in testing the effects of a pharmacological agent, namely that all the subjects receive the same purity and potency of a drug, and that the same exact drug will be available for future patients. And yet, that very act of standardization renders the therapy less real and less effective. Pair that problem with the fact that so much psychotherapy research uses inexperienced therapists or student therapists, and it is not hard to understand why such research has, at best, a most tenuous connection with reality. Consider the task of inexperienced therapists. They must establish a relationship with a patient characterized by genuineness, positive unconditional regard, and spontaneity. They urge patients to begin each session with their quote unquote point of urgency, as Melanie Klein put it, and to explore with ever greater depth their important issues as they unfold in the moment of encounter. What issues? Perhaps some feeling about the therapist, or some issue that may have emerged as a result of the previous session, or from one's dreams the night before the session. My point is that therapy is spontaneous, the relationship is dynamic and ever evolving, and there is a continuous sequence of experiencing and then examining the process. At its very core, the flow of therapy should be spontaneous, forever following unanticipated riverbeds. It is grotesquely distorted by being packaged into a formula that enables inexperienced, adequately trained therapists or computers to deliver a uniform course of therapy. One of the true abominations spawned by the managed care movement is the ever greater reliance on protocol therapy, in which therapists are required to adhere to a prescribed sequence, a schedule of topics and exercises to be followed each week. In his autobiography, Jung describes his appreciation of the uniqueness of each patient's inner world and language, a uniqueness that requires the therapist to invent a new therapy language for each patient. Perhaps I am overstating the case, but I believe the present crisis in psychotherapy is so serious and therapist spontaneity so endangered that a radical corrective is demanded. We need to go even further. The therapist must strive to create a new therapy for each patient. Therapists must convey to the patient that their paramount task is to build a relationship together that will itself become the agent of change. It is extremely difficult to teach this skill in a crash course using a protocol. Above all, the therapist must be prepared to go wherever the patient goes, do all that is necessary to continue building trust and safety in the relationship. I try to tailor the therapy for each patient to find the best way to work, and I consider the process of shaping the therapy not the groundwork or prelude, but the essence of the work. These remarks have relevance even for brief therapy patients, but pertain primarily to therapy with patients in a position to afford or qualify for open ended therapy. I try to avoid technique that is prefabricated and do best if I allow my choices to flow spontaneously from the demands of the immediate clinical situation. I believe quote unquote technique is facilitative when it emanates from the therapist's unique encounter with the patient. Whenever I suggest some intervention to my supervisees, they often try to cram it into the next session, and it always bombs. Hence, I have learned to preface my comments with, "Do not try this in your next session." But in this situation, I might have said something like this. My point is that every course of therapy consists of small and large spontaneously generated responses or techniques that are impossible to program in advance. Of course, technique has a different meaning for the novice than for the expert. One needs technique in learning to play the piano, but eventually, if one is to make music, one must transcend learned technique and trust one's spontaneous moves. For example, a patient who had suffered a series of painful losses appeared one day at her session in great despair, having just learned of her father's death. She was already so deep in grief from her husband's death a few months earlier that she could not bear to think of flying back to her parents' home for the funeral and of seeing her father's grave next to the grave of her brother, who had died at a young age. Nor, on the other hand, could she deal with the guilt of not attending her own father's funeral. Usually, she was an extraordinarily resourceful and effective individual who had often been critical of me and others for trying to quote unquote fix things for her. But now she needed something from me, something tangible, something guilt absolving. I responded by instructing her not to go to the funeral. Doctor's orders, I put it. Instead, I scheduled our next meeting at the precise time of the funeral and devoted it entirely to reminiscences of her father. 2 years later, when terminating therapy, she described how helpful this session had been. Another patient felt so overwhelmed with stress in her life that during one session she could barely speak, but simply hugged herself and rocked gently. I experienced a powerful urge to comfort her, to hold her and tell her that everything was going to be all right. I dismissed the notion of a hug. She had been sexually abused by a stepfather, and I had to be particularly attentive to maintaining the feeling of safety of our relationship. Instead, at the end of the session, I impulsively offered to change the time of her next session to make it more convenient for her. Ordinarily, she had to take off work to visit me, and this one time I offered to see her before work, early in the morning. The intervention did not provide the comfort I had hoped, but still proved useful. Recall the fundamental therapy principle that all that happens is grist for the mill. In this instance, the patient felt suspicious and threatened by my offer. She was convinced that I did not really want to meet with her, that our hours together were my low point of the week, and that I was changing her appointment time for my own, not her, convenience. That led us into the fertile territory of her self contempt and the projection of her self hatred onto me.